Howdy, folks. Today we're looking at Hellblazer number 85 from 1994 in DC Vertigo. The early 90s was a banner time for old John Constantine, as 1991 saw the beginning of Garth Ennis's milestone tenure on the book. That's the run that made his name in America and not coincidentally marked his first major collaboration with Steve Dillon, with whom Ennis would later go on to launch his signature book, Preacher, just a few months after the conclusion of their epical collaboration on the adventures of John Constantine. Of course, that still left the matter of who exactly was going to follow in the footsteps of a blockbuster team like Ennis and Dillon on Hellblazer. In the first place, Dillon was succeeded by another artist of no small caliber, Sean Phillips, then fresh off the run on Kid Eternity with Ann Nesenti that introduced him to an American audience after an early career spent largely in the service of Tharg. They fobbed off the question of Ennis's immediate successor in a most clever way. In the first place, they had the series' first writer, Jamie Delano, return for a special one-off featuring Phillips's premiere as series artist. And if you're curious about that very strange adventure, you can check out my review of it back in July on this very channel. But after that special curio, the series switched gears for a 4-issue stand by a most unexpected guest writer, the inimitable Eddie Campbell. Yes, that Eddie Campbell, creator of mythological romp Bacchus, as well as a towering corpus of semi-autobiographical material, stories organized under the general rubric of Alec, the name of his fictional doppelganger. But he's undoubtedly most famous for his work with Alan Moore on From Hell, a retelling of the Jack the Ripper murders, both heavily fictionalized and exhaustively researched. Incidentally, there's an absolutely hilarious aside here about the futility of speculating on the Ripper murders. This book roughly coincided with the release of the 6th issue of From Hell. As for the plot, well, John's been press-ganged for a trip around the world in the company of the ghost of Sir Francis Dashwood, chasing a millennial apocalypse heralded by urban legends. Wry and funny up to the very edge of terror, just like the very best Hellblazer stories. Howdy, folks. Today we're looking at Hellblazer number 86 from 1994 in DC Vertigo. John Constantine wakes up in Philadelphia on the trail of the end of the world with the ghost of Sir Francis Dashwood and joined by the ghost of Benjamin Franklin. Something smells fishy in the setup, however, and our boy goes out for a pack of smokes to mull it over. This is usually where the fun starts. Published 29 years ago, Eddie Campbell's meditation on the end of the world takes on a startlingly contemporary flavor in hindsight. The danger at the heart of the unraveling of reality seems all too real. As Franklin states, soon all the maps that guide us through our reality will be obsolete. All our systems of knowledge based on current perceptions will be useless. The membership of this newly reformed incarnation of the Hellfire Club intends nothing less than to bind the disparate parts of the modern world back into cohesive shape. The question is, are they on the up and up? A cabal of urban mystics waylay Constantine when he steps out for those cigarettes, cutting through the obfuscation of 18th century argot to redefine the menace as a multiplicity of viruses, both biological and virtual, systemic hijackers designed to destroy the world and its knowledge from the inside out. There's a reference here to disturbances in the Matrix that seems prescient, a familiar metaphor in the years before the movie effectively concretized the idea for a generation. There's a discussion of Ebola, one of the most terrifying monsters in the 90s bestiary, a profoundly disturbing metaphor for false beliefs infiltrating and disintegrating healthy systems. It's rather uncanny just how well Campbell was able to anticipate the anxieties of the future. This comic was published at the tail end of 1994, and already the romance of Robert Anton Wilson is dismissed as gratifying wank, human conspiracy overwhelmed and washed out by pure chaos seeping up from the floorboards and reducing everything it touches to a dead gray sludge. Hope for renewal, if such a thing is possible, can only be found in the rainforest, in whose biodiversity can be found home and source of modern mystery. There's a lot on the plate here, not the least of which is whether or not Constantine can actually trust any of the players. Dashwood and Franklin are surely dealing from the bottom of the deck, but the question remains, to what end? Campbell, such a clever and succinct writer, what appears as just a series of wry conversations, is gradually revealed to be nothing less than a shifting colloquy on the nature of modernity itself. Howdy, folks. Today we're looking at Hellblazer number 87 from 1994 in DC Vertigo. John Constantine is still hot on the trail of the end of the world, leading his merry band on an expedition to the other side of the globe from fair Philadelphia. After mugging a yuppie for his boarding pass, John sets off on a flight to Australia. Sometime during the flight, people start turning inside out, and there's an emergency landing in northern Australia. Considering the epic build-up to his showdown at the end of the world, it's fitting that the story breaks down at a bar in the middle of nowhere. The cat demon Bernard ends up cursed by an indigenous Australian shaman who recognizes the spirit as bad news. So, much of the issue is focused on Bernard tracking down the magician and then fighting a giant serpent creature summoned for the purpose. Meanwhile, the ghost of Sir Francis Dashwood remains skulking around the periphery of the story. John's great epiphany about the nature of Dashwood's scheme comes to him while watching an episode of Murder, She Wrote at a bar, and there's a definite charm to an Eddie Campbell story hinging on a bit of barroom banter. Sure, we've all noticed that death seems to follow Jessica Fletcher wherever she goes, but only John Constantine could take that insight and use it to solve an international magic conspiracy. The work of the inimitable Sean Phillips remains sterling throughout. He's got such a good hand with horror and the macabre, it's almost enough to distract you from the coloring. Sadly, what we see here is an early example of that most lamentable of phenomena, the so-called Vertigo Browns, a common lament for the line across much of its existence, in which otherwise excellent comic book art is slathered with murky shades of brown. But Phillips' work is strong enough to overcome the leveling effect here. You could easily print these stories in black and white without missing any nuance. There's something so eminently charming in the matchup between early Phillips' scratchy, slightly rumpled pen and ink line and the scratchy, slightly rumpled figure of Constantine, seen here bumming a ride across the outback. Howdy, folks. Today we're looking at Hellblazer number 88 from 1994 in DC Vertigo. And so John Constantine's great adventure with Eddie Campbell comes to a close, not with a bang, but a most definite whimper. The villain of the piece stands revealed not as some great reality-destroying virus, but the insanity of one man, or ghost, as the revenant spirit of Sir Francis Dashwood is revealed to be the genesis of the plague of unreality following John like a cloud of locusts since he left England. What initially appeared to John as a systematic breakdown of the world system is nothing more than the spiraling senescence of a dead white man resentful over no longer being at the center of the universe. As far as grand historical villains go, Dashwood is perhaps an obscure figure, but a fitting one for all that, a grand personage in his day, elevated in the fullness of time to a footnote, neither a Johnson nor a Boswell, just a guy famous for starting a club. Whatever actual plan that entailed his circumnavigating the globe, some sort of quest for power or renewed life, our boy puts an end to it with a trek into the most remote mountains he can find in the South Pacific. I've always thought there was something cozy in how John's journey in this stretch mirrors Campbell's own travels. A working-class Brit gets on a plane and winds up on the other side of the planet. Of course, I believe Campbell lives in Chicago now. Ultimately, Constantine's trip to the rainforest is an excuse to find a prison, a tree in an unmapped forest far from any other people, where he can trap Dashwood's spirit and be done with the matter for good. As he points out, he's just following in the grand tradition of taking our madness and dumping it where it isn't wanted. But John rarely gets a clean win in a walk into the sunset, and still usually ends up reifying the logic of empire somehow or another. It's a shame Campbell did so little work with the character, because this thin 4-issue stretch remains one of John's very best outings.